Right before Christmas, we talked about human populations, and now we're going to talk about the resources that it takes to sustain our human populations. So this first section is all about our resources, which are in the form of land that we live on, and then land that gives us the resources that we need. So as we go along through these slides, you may pause it at any point to take notes. You may replay it if you missed something, and then we'll go over the notes the next time I see you in class. So first off, let's look at how we use land. For humans, the highest percentage of our land goes to just forest, growing timber, wildlife, fisheries. The next highest percentage is rangeland for growing livestock, cattle, sheep. Then we've got farms, parks, recreation, wetlands, and then our urban land actually surprisingly only makes up about 3%. There's a big difference between urban land and rural land. Urban land has a high concentration of people on it. It has some kind of organization, a government, a city council. Rural land, however, has very few people and lots of open space. But even in the urban areas, we still need those rural areas to maintain our living. We need those wide open spaces to purify the air and the water. We need it for soil fertility, to regulate climate. All of these things are what's called ecosystem services, and those are the services that the land provides to us no matter where we live. Until the 1850s, most people lived in rural areas. They lived on big farmsteads. They were building their own houses out, way out from other people. They were growing their own crops and managing forests, and they were working in mines, but they're very spread out and not very urban. Then the Industrial Revolution came and changed this. With the rise of machinery, we needed fewer people in farms or in factories, so people could move closer to each other to work in more what we call service industries. They could work as teachers and policemen and shop owners, and less sustaining themselves and more sustaining each other. We also had better transportation, so that meant that we could create goods in one spot or grow crops in one spot and transport them to another area to be sold or used. So these two led to people going into urban areas. We had this process called urbanization. Urbanization is still ongoing. It's people moving from rural areas more into centrally located areas, urban areas. They're usually looking for job opportunities, and that's why people would move to Dallas or Houston, is usually for some kind of job opportunity. As these big cities grew, they kind of grew into what used to be smaller areas and formed big spreading areas called metropolitan areas. So think Dallas-Fort Worth. There's not just Dallas and Fort Worth, but there's also Irving and Grapevine and Arlington and all these other smaller cities and towns that got kind of eaten up by those bigger ones, and so it's one big massive area. A lot of your other big towns, Chicago and Washington D.C. are like this too. As these urban areas grew, we needed more services for the people that live there. Now, if urban areas grew very slowly, then we could plan for that. But one problem is when our cities grow too fast, we can't plan for them. So rapidly growing populations can quickly overwhelm the infrastructure. That can lead to traffic problems, housing problems, pollution problems. And so our infrastructure just can't keep up with the number of people that are moving into an area. So just remember the word infrastructure, I kept saying that. That's anything that people share. So roads and sewer lines, bridges, police stations, schools, anything like that that we all share. They can become quickly overwhelmed when our population grows in an area faster than we can keep up. You also have a problem when people move into urban areas, a situation called urban sprawl, and that's where we were in a very highly concentrated area, and now we've started kind of spreading out into the suburbs and taking over land that was on the outskirts of town. It could be used either for farmland or just as wilderness area, and now it's being taken over and used as housing. And it kind of leads to another problem. A lot of your people that live in those suburbs will commute to work by car, and so you have traffic issues and you have pollution issues from the cars being on the road, and so it kind of creates its own separate set of problems there. Another issue is when people want to live in one area, they tend to build on whatever land they can find, including land that isn't great for building on. We noticed this recently with hurricanes around Houston. We had a lot of neighborhoods getting flooded that really should have never been built on to begin with. They used to be wetland areas that people have drained and built neighborhoods on, and now they're showing their wetland self. They're underwater. Coastlines that are eroding, like Los Angeles, are not meant to be built on, but they are. So these areas people are building on because they're desperate to live in that area. We call it marginal land. Marginal as in not that great for building, but they're doing it anyway. In an urban area, we can create what's called a heat island. A heat island is the result of concrete and asphalt and steel and glass that traps heat in an area, absorbs that heat and traps it. It absorbs more than your natural vegetation, your grasses and your trees. And when we get heat islands, we can actually see the effects in our weather systems. That hot air that collects in our city rises and can actually create its own weather. It can affect the rain patterns around it. Sometimes if you notice the weather, our closest metropolitan area is Dallas-Fort Worth. If you notice sometimes when you're watching the Weather Channel or the radar and storms are moving through, you'll notice heavier rainfall or storms developing over Dallas and then moving into our area, and that's because of that heat that's trapped in that city that isn't in the surrounding natural vegetation area. So what is there to do? Well, there's a whole series of professions out there that are dedicated to planning our land to be used properly and to be used to its best potential. So land use planning involves anything from where we should put houses, what land should be protected, where our electrical lines should be placed, and land use planning has to provide a good balance between all these different companies and the individuals that are interested, the governments and whatnot, and so it can get to be controversial for some people as the citizens and the businesses and the governments all have their own agendas of what should be done with the land, but they have to make that best decision for the land and the people that are using it. One tool that they can use to plan land development is a system called GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. It's computerized. They take geographic data, anything from boundary lines to where the water systems are to elevation, and they can overlay that information, anything that they need to get a picture of what's going on in that area and make a good decision about where roads should go or water lines should go based on the features that are already there. Another problem with urbanization that we have to mitigate for when we're planning is urban runoff. Our solid surfaces like concrete, asphalt, they don't allow water to infiltrate the soil after precipitation. The soil is covered by an impermeable layer. So this does a couple of things. It doesn't allow the groundwater to recharge after a rainfall, and the water that does fall when it rains is run off quickly from these solid surfaces and can lead to flooding in some areas and lots of erosion in other areas. So to mitigate that, to increase that infiltration, we can do a couple of things. There's new inventions for permeable pavement, pavement and asphalt that will allow water to soak in. We can of course leave some green space and plant trees, and we can reduce that suburban sprawl by building up, having more high rises, and not out so much, not paving as much as of the land. We can also manage the transportation that is used. Many cities now have mass transit systems to reduce the number of cars to help with traffic, and of course this also helps with pollution. Buses and trains, this can help with like we said, traffic congestion. It can help save energy, it can reduce pollution, and it can reduce the loss of land. You don't have as many parking lots and as many roadways, you don't have as wide roads because more people are transported in smaller areas, smaller number, like this train here. We also have to plan for open space. If you notice, a lot of big cities that you've been to recently, Dallas, Denver, are planning for recreational enjoyment. There's parks, there's public gardens, there's hike and bike trails. Even Tyler, we have Rose Redmond Trail and some of the other parks in the area. A lot of these, especially if they're long and thin, used to be a right of way from a power line or a railroad. They're called green belts. They provide a lot of benefits. They can absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. They can filter pollution. They can absorb some of that heat and keep the city cooler. And they're a great place for the citizens to have relaxation and recreation. So we're going to stop here. We'll look next time at how we plan for food and some of our other industries that we need for our growing human population.